welcome everybody to our regular Wednesday night, most Wednesdays, series of community conversations hosted by the Vermont Sierra Club. Tonight, we've got a really interesting discussion all set up with several members of the Vermont business community that have been solidly on board with moving towards a sustainable world. And we have Kate Ogden, who's the Advocacy and Movement Building Manager with Seventh Generation. We have Chris Miller from Ben & Jerry's, who's the head of Global Activism Strategy at Ben & Jerry's, and Jordan Giaconia, who is the Public Policy Manager for Vermont Businesses for Social Responsibility and a Sierra Club alum as well. So it's great to have you all here. We should have a great discussion about these businesses and how they're supporting moving towards good work on climate and other issues. We'll have about each person will speak for about 5 or 10 minutes, and then we will be opening things up for questions and discussion. If you do have questions along the way, please feel free to enter them in the chat, and we'll follow the chat to call on people when we get there. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jordan. Welcome. Thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me. Can everyone hear me okay? Thumbs up. I see a thumbs up. Awesome. Well, wonderful. Again, a big thanks to Steve and Rob for having me, to the Sierra Club writ large. I'm obviously a big fan. As a former alum, used to work over at the Sierra Club's federal policy team, but I'm now here at Vermont Businesses for Social Responsibility. So VBSR is a statewide business association. We represent roughly about 700 member businesses across the state of varying sizes. It goes anywhere from our larger, really all-star brands like Ben & Jerry's and 7th Gen, for example, to some of our smaller startups like Mamava. All of us really united, I think, in a shared collective desire to protect sort of what we call a triple bottom line. We now have kind of switched it to a quadruple bottom line. So it's people, planet, prosperity, and parity as well. So that's looking to basically have businesses be a force for positive change, both in terms of how we treat our workers, as well as how we treat our environment and the communities that we strive to support. So obviously climate is just a very, very, very fundamental component of that work. I think I recognize that we're definitely, kind of preaching to the choir here when it comes to the devastating impacts really of Vermont's continued reliance on fossil fuels. So, a quick stat in terms of sort of the economic implications of that really is, for each year, Vermont spends about $2 billion on energy resources that pollute our air and further the climate crisis. This namely falls within our heating and transportation fuels. And of that $2 billion, about 3/4 or $1.5 billion leaves our economy, whereas efficiency and renewable energy development keep a lot more flowing into our local economies. So that's good, not just for our ecosystems, for our environment, for clean air, but also for our bottom line, really overall. That money continues to support our economy. So I think the point that I'm trying to drive home there is that, the engagement doesn't just come from a shared desire to protect our environment. There's also a very, very strong economic benefit when it comes to taking action to tackle the climate crisis. And many of VBSR's businesses, both large and small, really understand that and have taken action to do that. And I think a lot of that is driven both by understanding of this crisis, but also feeling some of the existing climate impacts within our state, whether that's spring arriving earlier, heavy rainstorms or more intensive storms, summer's becoming hot and drier, frequent floods damaging infrastructure. That really has a very, very strong impact on the recreation, food-driven tourism, manufacturing. It really runs across every facet of our state's economy. So the question is really, what are businesses doing to combat climate change? And I think that's kind of twofold. So I think it comes from your own internal practices. So that's more of sort of thinking globally and acting locally when it comes to their own business practices. I think in the early days, this began as sort of the tried and true principles of reduce, reuse, and recycle. But as we all know, there's a lot more to be done to tackle the climate crisis. And that sort of fourth very central component is to the other three R's is repower. So many businesses have found that shifting away from fossil fuels has not only yielded better impacts on their environment, but also, again, improved their bottom line. So on the clean power side, many businesses across the state have shifted over to solar and wind. And what that basically does is kind of essentially just spins the business's meter backwards. And in many instances, they're actually able to be credited for that excess power produced. Just a couple of examples. I mean, the Alchemist, Rock Art Brewery, Caledonia Spirits, Champlain College, Concept 2, a host of others. You can kind of see where my head is at these days as we head into election season with naming all those breweries. But anyway, and then in addition to that, looking at sort of clean vehicles, I mean, the cost comparisons in terms of a gas vehicle versus electric vehicle are out of this world. I mean, fuel expenses alone, if you're looking at a typical gas vehicle over, like, I think the stats of about over 150,000 miles, it's about 17,500 for a gas vehicle. It's 9,000 for an electric vehicle. So it's really a no nonsense type push there. Additionally, businesses are looking at clean, efficient home heating and cooling. That's the second largest source of carbon pollution in the state. And there's, again, additional incentives available for heat pumps, weatherization, but it also makes for a more comfortable work environment for workers, and a healthier one at that. Another one that I think is really fascinating is supply chain sustainability. So that's kind of multiple different aspects of that, but one of which is, sourcing materials from local producers. So if you're a local restaurant or local businesses, you're sourcing your materials, your ingredients from local farmers, and really supporting local food systems to minimize your carbon footprint. But when that's not possible and you're not able to get it locally, many businesses are pledging to work only with suppliers that adhere to strict social and environmental standards. So I'll give an example. Burton's on the call today, but another big climate partner. They have a list of restricted substances that their goods are produced by. So it's making sure that the chemicals and materials are good for people, good for the environment, and then have also made a point to focus strictly on having partnership with producers that ensures that you have minimal air and water emissions from manufacturing processes, and that they're very clean. So that's sort of that added aspect. But looking beyond that, beyond the internal aspect, because ultimately, while these voluntary actions are really, really integral to reducing emissions, only public policy can get us at that pace and scale in terms of reductions that we need to really tackle the climate crisis, given this moment that we're in. And because of the power that businesses have to shape public policy, they have a really, really vital role to play in building bipartisan support for climate action, or in Vermont's case, tripartisan support for climate action. And that's largely where groups like VBSR, like Seventh Generation, like Ben and Jerry's come in, and that we take the time to really try to challenge that long time sort of false dichotomy between economic development and sustainability, where folks feel that environmental initiatives are a hindrance to economic growth, which is really quite the contrary. So a good recent example, and I hope that you all will take a moment and just sort of celebrating this massive win that we had, was, the successful passage of the Global Warming Solutions Act. Really at the outset of the legislative session, I have to give a massive, massive thank you to Kate and Chris, who played such an integral role in this. We collaboratively put together, and VPIRG as well, collaboratively put together a massive employee climate lobby day in partnership with the Act on Climate Vermont Coalition. We brought in over 100 employees, met with elected officials. They called on the governor and the legislature to make climate change a priority, and to pass a package of laws that were intended to ensure that we met our goals of 40% reduction in greenhouse gas levels by 2030 and 80 to 95 by 2050, and really push that envelope even further. The Solutions Act, of course, is kind of the flagship of that. So employees really took the time to meet with their legislature and warn about the fact that it's reducing carbon emissions isn't just damaging to the environment, but also to our economy and our shared way of life. And these were folks who went across a whole bevy of different sectors, anywhere from manufacturing, brewing, renewable energy, banking, financial services. It really ran the full gambit. And we actually also had a really cool community forum with House and Senate leadership. So what does that do exactly? That kind of starts to shift and shift that public narrative around climate action and bring it up to the forefront, both for our legislators, for press, and for individual Vermonters, and lets folks know that there is a path forward that can lead to more just, equitable, healthy communities and a healthy economy as well. And then, when COVID came, we had to kind of shift that. We had to make that transition over to Zoom-based stuff and kind of work from afar. So again, that shared collaboration between VBSR member businesses with really led to a lot of really proactive tactics. Seventh Generation was really integral, and I, Kate, I wouldn't want to totally steal your thunder here, but basically, we collaborated on doing a massive print ad and digital ad that was calling on Governor Scott to support the Solutions Act. That was signed by over 75 businesses. There was also a business climate testimonial video that we circulated far and wide that had folks from The Alchemist, Bees Wrap, Brattleboro Savings and Loan, Burton, Vermont Creamery, Vermont Family Farms, 7th Gen, Mama Ba, many others. Again, really emphasizing the economic opportunity that we saw in climate action and the duty that we had not just to our shared enterprises, but to our consumers, to our communities, to support climate action. When you took all of this together, between businesses going on the record, speaking on this issue, by my count, it was well over 110 businesses across the state came out in support of the Solutions Act. And I have very little doubt that was integral in sort of shifting the conversation over and moving us toward climate action. So that's a big victory, and just one of many other examples out there. Looking ahead, I think there'll be other opportunities to emphasize again, sort of the business support for climate action. We're looking right now at the Transportation Climate Initiative. I think that's kind of one of the next big steps in looking to tackle emissions from one of our largest emitters. Transportation accounts for about 44.5% of Vermont's total emissions. And in the case of the Transportation Climate Initiative, you're looking at it where you can set a cap on emissions, and then you reinvest the proceeds into sustainable, equitable, and healthier transportation options. So you have many businesses that have voiced support of that already, and we're going to be looking to do some really critical organizing around that as well. So that just gives you kind of a basic snapshot, and from there I'll turn it over to Kate over at 7th Gen to speak to some of the more specific work that 7th Gen is doing. But I think the main point that I want to drive home is just that it's very clear that businesses have an ability to be a force for positive change when it comes to climate action, and we've seen many businesses speak truth to power on that, both in the Vermont State House and federally too. So it's exciting work. VBSR is proud to be a part of it and proud to work with wonderful partners like you all. Kate?
Hey, Jordan. Hi, everybody. My name is Kate Ogden. I'm the Advocacy and Movement Building Manager at 7th Generation. And I won't take up too much time, but did just want to, my face just got really big on my own screen. Hello, me. I wanted to take a second just to kind of zoom out and talk a little bit about 7th Generation's approach to advocacy overall. Obviously, we're a Burlington-based company. We have a long history of activism, really since the company was founded about 30 years ago. And I would say today our advocacy model really has kind of 3 main strands to it in the way that we sort of hold our theory of change, of the way that we want to create positive social change in the world. One, as Jordan has touched on here, like we have to have our own house in order. We have to reduce the impact that our business is having on the planet. The second is that we want to leverage our voice as a leading sustainable business for positive change and for systemic policy change. And then the third is that we want to use the platforms that we have, our communications platforms, to inspire our consumer audience to take action with us and to really get engaged. So when we sort of apply that theory of change to our understanding of our climate work and our climate justice strategy, we have set science-based targets as a company. We have set a 2025 sustainability goal of a 50% reduction in our scope 3, inclusive of scopes 1 through 3 across our entire business by 2025. And when you look at 7th Generation's emissions footprint, what you see is that over 90% of our emissions come from the consumer use phase of our products. So 92% of our emissions come from people using our products to wash and dry their dishes and wash and dry their laundry. So for all of the sort of sustainability work that we do when we think about the manufacturing, the distribution, the buildings, all of these other aspects of our business only account for 8% of our emissions. So all of the improvements, we are constantly striving and working to make greater and greater improvements in that area. But at the end of the day, like, it's pretty much a rounding error. Like, all the little tweaks and refinements that we make don't even begin to touch that 92% of our carbon emissions that come from the consumer use phase of our products. So very quickly, you see how for seventh generation, it's just not enough. Having a sustainability strategy is not enough if you're serious about the climate crisis. You have to have a proactive advocacy strategy, because the only way that we begin to touch those scope 3 emissions is by being part of the movement to radically and comprehensively transform our entire energy economy, so that when you are washing and drying your dishes and washing and drying your laundry, you are using clean and renewable energy sources to do that. So that's how we kind of come into our climate justice advocacy work at its foundation. It's very clear to us the role that we have to play. We started really seriously working on climate justice as our main advocacy campaign, I guess I would say, in 2018. So we started working with the Sierra Club and started in 2018 and 2019 with the Sierra Club's Ready for 100 team. And so in 2018, we had a shared goal with Ready for 100 of supporting the work to get 100 cities. I don't probably need to tell you all of this. We were trying to get 100 cities by the end of 2018 to commit to 100% clean and renewable energy by 2030. And in our work with Ready for 100 team, one of the things they came to us and said, the role that we could play is, there's this real gap in believability. Like, folks don't actually believe that renewables are ready to go today, that they're like off the shelf. We just have to scale it up. So can you help us, using your marketing expertise, using all of the consumer insights research that you have, all of this, like, can you help us shift consumer attitudes around renewables? So that was really the task that we sort of defined for ourselves in 2018. We worked to do a lot of storytelling, lifting up voices of climate activists around the country, helping to use those personal stories to illuminate the reality of where we are with renewables in this country. And I'm very happy to say that due to the very hard work done by the Ready for 100 team and all of the organizations and activists and folks all across the country who were activated in that campaign, I think ended that year somewhere in the 108, 109 city commitments. And obviously it's gone much, much higher since then. So that was really our first year in really, I think, seriously focused on climate justice as our primary advocacy work. In 2019, we expanded our view to think about, well, the next kind of obvious venue for us is at the state level. And so with relationships that we had cultivated through the Sierra Club and also through our relationship with the Solutions Project, we ended up working with the New York Renews Coalition and worked with them to pass what is now the strongest emissions reduction target in the nation. And we kind of used that sort of two-prong approach, where one was, how can we use our influence and our voice as a leading business? And then the other was, how can we invite our consumers to take action with us? So we worked with New York Renews. They hosted, probably in the last 10, 14 days of the legislative session, a big rally at the State House in Albany. Seventh Generation was there, and we worked with the coalition to decide to place a full-page ad in the 2 daily Albany papers the day following the rallies, with the idea that, like, as all these sort of legislatures finally can breathe a sigh of relief because the State House isn't filled with chanting hundreds of chanting, singing, marching people. They just want to like come to work and relax, and they'd open up their papers just to find like a full page letter addressed to them, calling on them to take the leadership stance that they need to take and pass that bill for a vote. We also did a lot of paid media and a lot of social to have 10,000 messages sent to New York legislatures, to the governor, and to the leadership of both chambers. So we, again, sort of thinking like, how are we just sort of standing up and using our voice as a business? And then how are we giving opportunities for, in this case, our New York-based consumers to take action with us? The other big piece of work for us in 2019 was working to activate folks around the global climate strike in September. We worked really closely with 350 on that, and similarly, kind of what they sort of came to us and said, like, you know, the thing that we could really use help with is like, how do we reach the people we're not already reaching? You know, like if you live in like the climate internet, as I like to call it, like, you know about the climate strikes. But if you don't live in the climate internet, then like, it's very possible that you have not even heard that this is happening, which is mind blowing to me, but I think is the case. So we donated a week's worth of television advertising, and were able to use our relationships with different creative agencies to find an agency that was really excited to work with 350 for free to produce a 30-second ad spot that ran during Good Morning America the week leading up to the climate strike. So just helping to get, and it was entirely unbranded by Seventh Generation. I think we had to like put a disclaimer on it. Apparently there's some laws around that. If you're going to pay for an ad, you have to put your name on it. But other than a brief appearance at the end, it was 350, it was their activists, it was their message in the middle of Good Morning America. So I was really excited about that. And we were also able to help arrange kind of like a family corner of the Burlington climate strike event, which was really great too. So we were stoked to be able to activate all of our employees here and have them come with their families, and then also kind of helping on the national level. And then this year, I won't go into it too much because Jordan did a great job, but we started off the year with a really big focus on climate policy here in the state of Vermont. It's a really incredible community of businesses in the state. It's been really exciting. I'm still fairly new to 7th Gen. I'm just actually wrapping up year 2. And so it's been a really great experience to get to know all of the different businesses that are in the state. Folks are super engaged, really excited to be working together on this. So we did some great work in the beginning of the year, weren't sure how it was going to end up, and it was really exciting to be able to close this out, passing the Global Warming Solutions Act into law. And then, you know, obviously the other big piece of work for us this year on our climate justice work has been turning out the vote for the election. And we've had 4 kind of main pieces to our election strategy. We've worked with other businesses to advocate for federal funding and guidelines for states to implement safer election practices for everyone everywhere. We know that some folks, no matter what, are going to have to vote in person, and particularly indigenous communities across the state tend to have poor or no residential mail service on reservations. And so we've worked with our partner Native Votes to do directed donations of disinfectant to community organizations on the ground who can get those into polling places, and also for their on the ground partners who are doing get out the vote work in indigenous communities. We are partnering with Earth Guardians and their sort of youth-led climate arm to help them with their work to get out the youth vote, because unlike Ben and Jerry's, the youth aren't that excited about 7th Generation and doing their own laundry. So we sort of are like, how can we help get out the youth vote without us being the ones telling the youth to vote, because they probably won't be that inspired by us. And then the 4th piece and the main piece of that work has been our work to get out our core consumer, which is sort of an older millennial parent. It's me, basically. I'm the core 7th Generation consumer. And so we have created a lot of work sort of under the broad umbrella of Vote for the Future, and have highlighted a lot of youth climate activists on our site with, in their own words, folks who aren't yet going to be old enough to vote in this election, and in their own words saying to our consumer audience. Why should they vote? Why should they vote with climate in mind? And you can pledge to vote for a specific climate activist and share that on your social network. And we've done a lot of sort of social and storytelling work under that general umbrella of voting for climate and voting for the future. And as many folks are also thinking now and turning towards how are we ensuring the integrity of this election? So obviously we know, 70% of the American public across partisan lines wants to see government action on climate change, and we need to make sure that all of those people can vote and that all of their votes are counted, and that the leaders that we elect into office reflect the will of the people and the will to see action on climate change. So that's the last 3 years in a nutshell. I'll pass it over to Chris Miller.
Thanks, Kate. I will be relatively brief here. I do want to thank Steve and Rob for sort of providing the forum here, and it's great to be on the panel with both Jordan and Kate. I think we're incredibly lucky in the state of Vermont. Our small community, and particularly our business community, I think, punches well above its weight. And I think that's in part because of the work that VBSR does. I think without a doubt, they are the most effective national chapter of kind of BSR in the country. And we're incredibly fortunate to have them doing the work that they do in the state. And I also want to thank Kate. We're also, as a business community, incredibly fortunate to have Kate in the state and doing the work that she's doing. She really was the powerhouse from the kind of business community side that led the coalition of companies around the work to ultimately pass the Global Warming Solutions Act. So it's really wonderful to have Kate doing what she's doing at Seventh Generation. I'll talk briefly about kind of a little bit of the work that we're doing around Ben & Jerry's, and I want to touch a little bit around sort of the role of companies in kind of doing this work. I'll start with the kind of rhetorical question you posed, Jordan. What are businesses doing to fight climate change? And I think the answer to that question is not enough. We have not yet got the business community engaged in the way that we need them to be engaged. A little bit about Ben & Jerry's. So two things are true about our company. One is we're a dairy company and we have a pretty sizable, carbon footprint. The biggest piece of our footprint comes from, dairy farms that are producing the milk and cream that we use to produce our ice cream, 30 miles north of where I'm sitting here in Burlington. We can talk a little bit more about the kind of work that we're doing on our dairy farms, and it's not enough and we need to do more. It's also true we're investing pretty heavily in our plant-based portion of our portfolio. So our non-dairy vegan flavors have about a 30% lower overall carbon footprint than our dairy line. So investing in growing that as a proportion of our overall portfolio is a really important part of our strategy to reduce our emissions. Like Seventh Generation, we have science-based targets. But I think, and Jordan and Kate, you both sort of touched on this. It's not enough simply for us to focus inside the four walls of our company. I mean, we could turn Ben & Jerry's off tomorrow and the planet's still headed over a cliff. And so, for better, for worse, corporations are the most powerful entity in society, and it's most often for worse, right? But the opportunity is that companies can use the leverage and power that we have, both as a platform to talk to people, as well as the influence we have with policymakers to speed up the transition to the, no net zero economy that we need to build. There are a couple of things that are true about companies. And I think, you know, what Kate talked about in terms of 7th generation support for the global climate strike and the youth leading that, and their ability to basically put a world-class marketing team to work in service of youth activists is really speaks to the potential power that we have as companies, and particularly sort of consumer-facing brands, to support the work that groups like the Sierra Club, and, you know, we have a long relationship with 350 and others on this work. You know, both Kate and I are Greenpeace alums, and you know, I spent half a dozen years leading the climate change campaign back in the mid 2000s. You know, what I will say about my time at Greenpeace, in addition to the fact that it was, you know, kind of the best 6 years of my life, career-wise, just it was so rewarding and fulfilling, is that I worked with an incredibly sort of passionate group of activists that were super committed to saving the planet. What's interesting about where I work today is that I also work with passionate people who care about, you know, making change in the world, but they're world-class marketers, and they're people that are exceedingly good at selling shit. And I don't want to, you know, be trite about it, but the idea of selling the fact that climate change is a thing and that we have to keep fossil fuels in the ground and we have to rapidly accelerate the transition to a low carbon economy is not dissimilar fundamentally from selling chocolate fudge brownie. And so the team that I work with is really great at selling stuff and sort of harnessing the power of a brand like Ben & Jerry's or 7th Generation or Patagonia, or I mean, we go on and on and on, the potential to kind of harness that to be a part of driving change on an issue like climate change, I think is pretty dramatic. And so, you know, as you all sit in sort of outside of the corporate sphere, I do think, in addition to pressuring fossil fuel companies and pressuring banks that finance this stuff and insurance companies that underwrite policies for the fossil fuel industry, thinking about how to pressure consumer-facing brands to sort of pick a side here and to make that side known, I think is important. You know, I guess I just close with a couple of quick thoughts. In that same vein, companies like, and Kate touched on it again, in sort of how they approach the global climate strike. Companies like ours, we don't preach to the choir. When I was at Greenpeace, we talked to Greenpeace supporters, and Greenpeace supporters care about the climate and the planet. Our fan base, and it's large, right? We're in 40 countries around the world. We have, you know, 9 million followers on Facebook. We have, you know, massive marketing budgets that allow us to speak to people. And we don't necessarily preach to the choir. Our largest customer is Walmart, right? So people are buying our products in middle America and pulling it out of the freezer case at Walmart. And so we don't speak to the choir. We have the ability to help kind of mainstream ideas, movements, and actions to a more kind of general population. And so I think, again, that's part of the kind of power that the kinds of companies that have been engaged in this stuff can bring to the fight. We have been primarily focused on issues around racial justice in the US over the last 3 years or so, specifically the need to reform the criminal justice system, but we've remained engaged on issues of climate, particularly here in the state of Vermont, supporting Jordan and Kate's lead from the corporate side and passing the Global Warming Solutions Act. I will tell you, we're running a big campaign in Australia, which is an important market for us, that's focused specifically on getting elected officials in Australia to pledge off of taking fossil fuel funding and a focus on building a kind of just recovery as we come out of the you know, economic downturn eventually that has been caused by coronavirus. I guess the final thing I'd say before I shut up and hand it back to you all is, I think for many companies, they're nervous about stepping out on these issues because they're not perfect, right? I mean, as I said, we are a company that has a sizable carbon footprint, and we're doing a lot to reduce it, but we're certainly not perfect. And I think most companies are moderately risk averse and worry that if they step out on this stuff, they'll sort of have their head handed back to them. And so I think, it's work that people like Kate and I and Jordan have to do to convince more companies to engage on this, because, at the end of the day, our companies are profoundly at risk from climate change. I mean, we're a food company. I mean, we're sourcing ingredients from all over the world, and we are already, and have been for several years, seeing impacts from a warming planet as it relates to costs of dairy. We've seen spikes in costs for coffee, cocoa, and vanilla because of changes in climate patterns in the regions that produce those ingredients for us. And that will only get worse over time. And so for all of us as corporations, this is kind of personal. And I think, we need more companies to kind of match what they're doing inside their businesses with promoting the kinds of policy-based solutions outside their businesses. So with that, I will hand it back to Steve.
Great. Well, thanks so much. Great thoughts, Chris, Kate, and Jordan. Yeah, it's interesting that you end on that question of food security, which to me, having looked at a lot of different aspects of climate for a long time, I think that is sort of the sleeper, that question of food security, where the amount of food that we can grow is predicted to drop by something like 20% in the next few decades. And of course, we all know the global population is increasing by about that much. So some people have said that we can expect our food to cost 50% more than it has, which translate that into a social justice framework, and who's going to have that money to spend and who's not. So it's quite a challenge we're up against. Well, we've got a number of questions coming in. Scott Weathers has put up a question about consumer trends. Scott, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, everyone. This is really, really incredible. I'm just so excited to see everyone, all of y'all's leadership on these important issues. So just really impressed, and yeah, thank you for everything you're doing. I work at a nonprofit called the Good Food Institute that focuses on the plant-based ecosystem in particular. That's one consumer trend that I think is having a pretty positive impact on the world, and very interested in all the examples that y'all provided in terms of the ways that you're helping support activism. I think that's obviously a really critical component of social change, obviously. And Kate, I really loved your example about demand creation on renewable energy, and Chris, obviously Ben & Jerry's is playing such a huge role on the plant-based front. I love eating the plant-based Cherry Garcia all the time. It's my favorite. But yeah, would just be interested if any of y'all want to comment on the plant-based trend specifically. I'd love to hear that, as well as any other trends, or I don't know, consumer shifts. I don't know what the trend sounds like, kind of faddish, but whatever word you want to use for it, things that consumers are doing or with regard to their preferences that you're excited about.
I'll jump in quick and then hand it over to Kate. I think a couple of things. I mean, clearly the trend around plant-based is a big one. I think, we for quite some time had been interested in finding a solution that provided a wider portfolio that would appeal to, just a different kind of consumer, those who are vegan, those who are lactose intolerant. And I think we have very high product standards, which is probably why we were behind some of the other early movers, is that we were not going to do it unless we could do it in a way that was Ben & Jerry's-y. And so I think the fact that we now have flavors, plant-based flavors like Cherry Garcia, where we were willing to create a flavor that has a full fat dairy version of it, indicates the kind of confidence that we had that the product was super wonderful, and it is a very fast growing part of our portfolio, and as I said, it is an important business driver, but it is a critical component to achieving our science-based emissions reductions targets. We don't get there without the plant-based becoming a much bigger piece of our portfolio. So we're pretty committed to making that happen. Just at a macro level as well, I think consumer and citizen expectations on companies are changing. It's not like, and maybe it's partly because sort of typical institutions that people look to drive change in the world seem so broken and ineffective at the moment, that consumers and citizens are looking for corporations to be much more actively involved in promoting solutions to the problems that society is facing. But it will be increasingly harder, I believe, for companies to sit on the sidelines on issues like climate change, issues like racial justice, that companies are going to have to be engaged on these issues, or they risk being irrelevant at best, or sort of run off the side of the road at worst. So I think that's true.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I would build onto that, I was going to say exactly the same thing. I see all of these like consumer insights, decks come across my desk about Gen Z, and Gen Z was really like, this is a consumer that really, wants to be able to feel like the brands that they are engaging with have sort of a social consciousness and a social awareness. What that tells me is like, this is going to be an increasingly crowded space. And I think that the job for us at Seventh Generation, the job for Ben and Jerry's, like it's that much more important that we bring a real theory of change that's grounded in systemic solutions to these big problems, that's grounded in equity, that's grounded in justice. Because as you start to see more and more companies jumping into this that aren't bringing that type of political analysis and an analysis grounded in the connections between all of these different movements, then what you're just going to see is a space that's just crowded with cause marketing. And that is something that sort of, I wouldn't say it worries me, but it's something that in addition to, I think, the role that companies like ours play in the climate movement and in the goals that we have specifically around climate justice, around, a just transition, it's also setting a high bar and sort of creating a model for what it means for a corporation to engage in the space. Like, what does it actually look like? And I think that we are, we're trying really hard through, trial and error and the relationship building that we're doing to understand what it means for a corporation to, if not be part of the climate justice movement, like I think that's probably a bridge too far, but what does it look like to be a good partner to the climate justice movement, and have that be, a truly like transformational relationship. So I think a lot about that. And then I think the other obvious one for Seventh Gen is plastic. To totally change gear, I think plastic is to Seventh Gen probably what dairy is to Ben and Jerry's. And similarly, like we have very high product standards across not only things like emissions, but also health. And so it's a real, I know, in my early days at Seventh Generation, I remember having a very emotional conversation with someone on our sustainability team who was really grappling with everything that I think we as a society have learned in the last 4 or 5 years about the complete lie that we've been sold around recycling, and the impact that is having, while also having to hold, whether that is, concentrating our products, no matter what it is, like you have very, 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 very safe products. And if you concentrate them to at a certain point, they can go from being very, very, very safe to irritating. So, just super concentrating our products so that they're using less plastic, like that has its challenges. You don't want to substitute for a material that is much heavier and makes your emissions footprint go way up because it's harder to ship. So it's a real challenge. We did just launch a completely plastic-free line of products that's available through Grove, and it's kind of our first foray into like the completely plastic-free space, which is where we know that we need to be. And because of our very high product standards across not just sustainability, but also health and equity, it's a little bit of a balancing act for us, but it's clear that that's where we need to go. And it's where I think our consumers want us to go.
Great, thanks so much. Well, speaking of balancing acts, Connor O'Sullivan has a question about metrics, which I know is, he's got a good question. And I know it comes up as one of the issues with the Global Warming Solutions Act as it plays out too, not just with greenhouse gas accounting, but with everything else that they're trying to address. Coming up with metrics is one of their charges. Connor, do you want to bring up your question?
Yeah, briefly, I could speak to the group. So I originally went to school in Northern Vermont for ski resort management and then shifted to corporate sustainability. And one of the big things we're learning is the transparency and how important that is to market groups, but also the metrics and reporting that they will be doing, whether they're adhering to certain standards such as the SASB, Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. And if the groups in Vermont are thinking of working together or are operating on the same platform so that when they do present their reports at year end or as they're working through their programming, that there's a unified front that they can show to everyone, and possibly the thought process behind that as to how it seems very unified in what they're doing. Sorry for a little bit of a rambly question.
Is that something that your companies are engaged in?
I can jump in first just to say that I don't know is the answer on my end. We do have like our team sort of covers both sustainability and the advocacy side. I know that through, and Chris can probably bail me out here, but I know that through the process of setting science-based targets, like I know that that's also kind of like its own institution, I think, in terms of like verifying and reporting and tracking results. So I don't know about SASB specifically, but Chris might.
Well, so and Kate, and some of you may know, I actually spent half a dozen years at 7th Generation before jumping to Ben & Jerry's. And so I actually used to manage the sustainability reporting at 7th Generation. It I believe is Global Reporting Initiative, GRI compliant is the standard I think that 7th Generation uses, not SASB. But I think to your point, having a standard for the way in which corporations report their material and environmental impacts is incredibly important. The investment community, consumers, students need to be able to look at sort of an apples to apples comparison. And I will be perfectly honest with you, our reporting sucks. Maybe it's a little harsh, but we at Ben & Jerry's, as a sort of vestige of the acquisition agreement with Unilever in 2000, we have what it's like the laws of unintended consequences. There was this brilliant idea that we wanted to hold Unilever accountable to continuing to invest in growing the social mission of the company. And so as required by the acquisition agreement, the company needs to grow the impact of the social mission at a rate that is greater than or equal to year-over-year financial performance, right? And that's really hard to measure, right? I mean, it's really easy to know how much more ice cream we sold in a particular year, but trying to measure our activism, our supply chain work, and somehow map that in a way that allows you to say we either did or didn't grow year over year. If the company grew 6% year over year, did we grow the impact of the social mission? So our focus as it relates to reporting has always been around that and reporting to our board at the expense of a more standardized approach to material impacts and sustainability reporting that we are transparent about. So we have an annual report called the Social Environmental Audit, the SEER report, it is much more qualitative than quantitative. I will tell you that will change next year. And I think you will see a much more rigorous and transparent approach to both sustainability reporting as well as our work around issues of racial equity. So we 7 Generation way ahead of us as it relates to reporting. They've been doing a stellar job on it for years and years and years, and we have some catching up to do.
Great, thanks. Peter's put up a couple of questions. Peter, do you want to go ahead and voice one of those questions?
Sure thing. Thank you guys for coming out. I think this is really cool to see this side. You normally see corporations paired with, like, you know, evil villains and like the perpetuators of climate change. So it's good to see that there's a reverse movement coming out there. The question I have for you is sort of what, when you're in sort of meetings with companies and you're bringing up things that are sort of focused on sustainability and equity, how do you sort of get people on your side? Like, what kind of angles do you sort of throw at the issue to sort of make it relate to people? And the only reason I say this is because I have an uncle who owned a farm in Ohio, and it was very hard for him to see climate change as something that was going to impact him directly. And, you know, as somebody who knows about the movement, it's like, of course you're farming, why wouldn't you be impacted? But he didn't seem to see that trend. So what do you guys do to sort of get people on your side or convince, you know, turn some heads?
I could take part of that, Steve. Thank you for the question. Peter, so Peter, on one end, I would say, so from VBSR side of things, it's, you know, we have an advocacy component. That's the largely the part that I spearhead, but there's also a very significant public education and public engagement programming that we work with, or business engagement rather, and business education that focuses oftentimes very specifically on sustainability. And part of that comes, you know, in terms of, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. You have to create relatability and make folks understand that these impacts will impact your business directly. And we've managed to highlight that in many instances over the years. But also the fact that you need to present it as an opportunity. It's a streamlining, making your businesses more sustainable has positive impacts on your bottom line. It may require some upfront investments, but there's oftentimes policies that can help you move the ball forward there. And then in addition, just highlighting, as we mentioned before, changes in consumer trends. You know, I think so that education component, that gets your foot in the door, it makes people aware of the problems, and then you present to them specific solutions. So, you know, I'll give you a good example. We just did our conference. We had like record attendance. I think it was like 450 or so business leaders from across the state. And we had 3 central kind of issues we were covering. We were doing climate, racial justice, and business resiliency in the time of COVID. And that climate track, I like to think, really turned a lot of heads in terms of, you know, really exposing some of the fiscal opportunities, some of the operational opportunities of sustainability within your business. I'll echo Chris's point that getting folks to wade into the advocacy arena is a much tougher lift because of the optics. But I will say that the work of folks like Ben and Jerry's, like 7th Generation, is that they're shifting the public narrative around sustainability, so it actually becomes more of an appeal to start to step out on that. But it is slow, arduous work, and it really isn't happening at the pace that we need it to.
Well, Jordan, maybe to pick up on that, on stepping out on advocacy a little bit. You know, as was mentioned before, Vermont just passed this Global Warming Solutions Act, and you know, it talks about greenhouse gases, but it also talks about things like resiliency and adaptation, and sort of rethinking how we move forward in an age of a changed climate. And wonder if you've given much thought to how businesses might help the state shape that future in that context. It sets up a climate council, and that'll be working together for decades, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the really cool aspects of the Solutions Act, so not only does it turn Vermont's emissions goals into requirements, it creates a very diverse climate council that's intended to basically create a climate action plan that is used to inform ANR's rulemakings as it relates to emissions reductions requirements and other rulemakings across the state. A number of those seats, they're appointed. There's some appointees from the administration, appointees from the Speaker's office, and appointees from the Committee on Committees, which is Lieutenant Governor and a number of senators. A number of those seats are all basically business leaders. You've got the agricultural sector and your farm and forest, so the sort of working lands components. You've got your manufacturers and you've got small businesses are just three examples of some of the seats that are on there. There's also fuel dealers and folks who work within more of the renewable energy sector. So we have been in steady contact with House and Senate leadership on sort of recommending appointees, and I've been reaching out to member businesses across the state, really seeing if they'd be interested in participating, if this is an opportunity, and then really sort of committing ourselves to act as a dedicated resource for these business leaders to be able to be very outspoken voices on this climate council, because they are ultimately the ones that are going to really help to inform this process and make sure we drive forward equitable solutions. There are a number of subcommittees within that structure too that focus on social and environmental justice and environmental equity, reducing energy burdens for low-income rural Vermonters, traditionally historically underserved groups. So there are some really there's a lot of exciting potential there. They have basically the course of next year to put together that plan. And then we really have to get the ball moving to get our emissions reductions down, because we are, kind of woefully behind. So that's one exciting area of it. And, we're really looking forward to implementing.
Yeah, great. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Well, we're pretty much at the end of our hour here. So I'd like to thank Jordan and Kate and Chris for joining us tonight. Rob Kidd, we often turn to you for a closing comment on what's next with our next week and following weeks. There we go.
Good, everybody. So actually, we're actually going to be taking a couple days off from these because we got the elections coming up. So we think a lot of people are going to be paying much more attention to the elections. But actually, I want to reference that Jordan at VBSR is doing a conversation next Wednesday at noon on the Transportation Climate Initiative. So we're not doing our conversation next Wednesday, but that's something interesting that you can, if you're interested in learning more about that. So I'll give a little plug in for Jordan on that. And then we're not doing it the day after election because nobody's going to be wanting to be talking politics. I think we're going to be celebrating with some of the other Vermont businesses who are big supporters of acting on climate change. But then we go with November 11th. This is a new concept, which actually Vermont Goes Green. It's a transportation website clearinghouse, which actually was formed from our Ready for 100 group in Burlington. So thanks for some of the support we were given, that they're trying to create this clearinghouse information site around transportation. So we want them to tell their story about how grassroots community groups can do something, but also explain this website. And then we're following up on November 18, reducing carbon footprint and investments. And that's going to include our state treasurer, Beth Pierce, and Ben Cushing of the Sierra Club Financial Advocacy. And it's all going to be talking about what Beth has done to change the marketplace and investments about reducing carbons, but then also what the Sierra Club National has been doing about impacting the corporate boardrooms and investment decisions out there. So these are going to be other conversations. And if anybody has any other interest in other conversations, please contact me and give me recommendations of who to speak. And then as well, all of our conversations are posted on our website at sierraclub.org/Vermont. I've been telling people /, but it's / and thanks for Steve for correcting me on that. And then on our events tab, you can see the events coming up, and then also the recording of all of our community conversations. So this one will be loaded up tomorrow afternoon. after I finally get around to doing it tomorrow, editing out and making it ready for historical purposes. So thank you all for participating. Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Kate, and thanks,